You know, emotions are a term that we use, and we all, I think, have some kind of common agreement about what we mean when we say emotions until it comes time to define the word. Because we talk about emotions all the time, and good Lord, you know, most popular music and some unpopular music is all about emotions. So is art. But what are emotions, and how do they differ from thoughts? How do they differ from motor skills? We're going to explore that and many other questions today in a wide-ranging conversation about emotions, including some new words for subtle emotions that you have but have no name for, after this news.
Stunning 8K resolution meditation app. In honor of the revolution, it's half off at the Gap. Deadpool self-awareness, loving parents, harmless fun. The backlash to the thing that's just begun. There it is again, that funny feeling, that funny feeling.
All right, today, well, let me set it up a couple of different ways. So I have a friend who checks in on me. He knows I'm dealing with some things in my family and my life. And today, my friend, let's call him Greg, sent me a text, which he usually sends me the same text. And the text is just, how are you? And I haven't answered the text yet because, you know, I want to answer honestly and accurately, but how are you? I don't know, how am I right now? What sorts of feelings am I having right now? How am I dealing with the stuff I have to deal with every day? What's making me happy? What's making me sad? What's making me worried? And in what sorts of gravitational pulls and pushes do those emotions and other feelings exist inside of me at a given moment? It's actually, if you want to be an accurate reporter, that's hard. It's hard, really, to give an assessment of how you are if you're determined to be honest about it, which, by the way, Greg, is why I haven't gotten back to you. That's number one. Number two, getting ready for this show, and I think I have this right. I didn't have time to look it up. But I think on the subject of time, St. Augustine says, if no one asks me, I know what time is. If someone asks me, I have no idea what time is. And you could almost say the same thing about emotions. It's a word. Emotion has a meaning to us until we are asked to provide a definition. Fortunately, we have guests on the show today who are prepared to provide definitions, and in some cases to provide you even with new words for emotions you have that have no name. By the end of today, one of the emotions you'll feel, one of the emotions that will inhabit you, if that's what emotions do, will be the sense of being much more prepared to experience and name your emotions. And that's a guarantee. So joining us right now is Edgar Gerard Hughes, a researcher at London's Queen Mary Centre for the History of the Emotions, and editor of the Book of Emotions, also known as How Do You Feel here in the United States? Because we're in the United States, that's the kind of thing we ask, is how do you feel? So first of all, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. And that's a lovely quote by St. Augustine. I'm not sure I've heard that before, but it really does encapsulate something that the book is trying to get across much more verbosely than you put it just there. So,
right.
Yeah,
so, but let's get at that a little bit. I mean, we have to have some kind of working definition for emotion or emotions. So what's that going to be?
Well, so I think there is a common sense view of emotions that most people have inherited, which is they are basically sensations or kind of bodily fluctuations that kind of the consciousness of which exists in some corner of our mind. And most of the time we're mostly in control of our thoughts, and thoughts are completely separate from emotions. And then once in a while, a strong feeling will bubble up and overwhelm us, and we'll have a choice of whether to resist it or to accept it and allow our actions to be dictated to it by it. And I think that's how a lot of people think of emotions, is basically as sensations in that way. And I think a good way to start thinking about that is emotions. I mean, emotions literally means motion. It comes from a French word meaning motion. And actually, that only started to be used in English commonly around the 18th century. So the word emotion, although emotion seems like a universal and timeless thing, it's actually not been around as a word in English that long. And before then, we had a much more diverse and diffuse way of talking about feelings, which include words like passion or sentiment or sensibility. And all of those things meant slightly different things. It could be they had a moral implication, or they emphasized the physical element of it, or religious connotations. And really, that idea of emotions being sort of bodily things that are kind of beyond your control, maybe some remnant of an animal instinct, that started to come up in the 18th century and really got developed with evolutionary theory. So I think when we talk about emotions, we're unconsciously endorsing this idea that emotions are basically kind of animal instincts that exist in a separate corner of our brain. And I'm not saying we should never do that. I'm not anti-science, and I'm certainly not anti-evolutionary theory, but I think maybe that does a disservice to the range of phenomena we're talking about when we're talking about feelings. And that's kind of what this book is trying to do, is just explore some of those different ways of thinking about emotions and how they manifest and how we kind of negotiate them.
All right, so I'm going to play a clip from a movie called Inside/Out. And this is a movie, if you've never seen it, in which emotions are kind of abstracted. There are these kind of abstracted characters. The one thing that I can tell you about Inside Out is that if you don't have a lot of experience with drugs, and you happen to on a given evening have been given a sublingual cannabis product, and then you're looking for, don't watch this movie, all right? Because if you're already freaked out, it will really scare you. I think it's meant to be a very gentle comedy. But so you're going to hear a whole bunch of famous people voicing the emotions: joy, fear, anger, disgust, sadness. And you're going to hear the two human characters, Riley and her dad.
Here we go. All right, open.
This looks new.
Think it's safe?
What is it?
Okay, caution. There is a dangerous smell, people. Hold on, what is that?
This is disgust. She basically keeps Riley from being poisoned, physically and socially.
That is not brightly colored or shaped like a dinosaur. Hold on, guys. It's broccoli! Yucky! Well, I just saved our lives. Yeah, you're welcome.
Riley, if you don't eat your dinner, you're not going to get any dessert.
Wait, did he just say we couldn't have dessert?
That's anger. He cares very deeply about things being fair.
So that's how you want to play it, old man? No dessert? Oh, sure. We'll eat our dinner right after you eat this.
Riley, here comes an airplane.
Oh, airplane. We got an airplane, everybody.
So to some degree, this movie works off a notion called basic emotions theory. This notion, and Edgar, maybe you can help me out here, but as I understand it, it's a theory that certain emotions that are kind of like the primary color equivalents of emotions are hardwired into human beings. We just have them. So react to that.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say, before I criticize the theories underlying that film, that it's a lovely movie, and obviously it made me cry, and obviously there's something very, very real about that portrayal it has of different kind of impulses and feelings battling within you for your attention, and especially it's great. I mean the sort of valorization of sadness as a positive emotion at the end of it is really moving and lovely. I think that the basic emotions theory basically says that there are a certain number of core emotions that are basically universal and exist throughout all cultures and times, and they're called basic emotions, and they're essentially the building blocks for all other more complex types of feeling. I think that there's nothing really basic about emotions at all. We can kind of categorize emotions in lots of different ways. There are languages, for instance, that don't have a concept of anger. or which who conflates anger and fear. There are Inuit cultures that don't have a concept for anger. There are cultures in the Southeastern Asia where if you show an angry face, then they will categorize that as fear. There's no single emotion which is universally expressed or universally acknowledged all over the world. And really, every time we use a word for an emotion, we're kind of telling a story about what that emotion means and how it feels. So, there's things like happiness indexes which measure how happy different populations are in different countries across the world. But maybe that would be different if we used a word like contentment, which has different connotations. There are some cultures who aspire to happiness and think of that as a goal for their life, and there are some where it's seen as basically a bit superficial and contemptible. So every time we use a word for an emotion, I think that we are sort of telling a narrative about that and saying something about ourselves as well. So there's much more room for negotiation between different feelings.
Right. So, and I think I want to come back to the cultural piece, the anthropological piece, maybe a little bit towards the end of the show. But I think even within any standing culture, there are differences. I mean, tests like the Myers-Briggs personality evaluations, those kinds of things. One of the axes they look at is thinking versus feeling. Just very quickly here, people listen to the show for a long time. I used to have on with me as sort of an announcer / sidekick and producer, Kyone Wolf, and eventually we did kind of a Myers-Briggs evaluation, and it was pointed out to me that she's a much more emotion-centered kind of person. She processes a lot of life through her emotions, which I tend not to do, which had resulted in massive misunderstandings between us. By the way, she now has her own wonderful show here on this station called Audacious, which is kind of almost a little bit of an emotional title. And if you listen to the show, she's so terrific at it. But she asks people a lot, how did that feel? How are you feeling? Whereas, Edgar, I'm probably not going to ask you how it felt to publish your book. I'm going to ask you a bunch of other questions. So, I mean, I think there's a suggestion anyway that we are not all created emotionally equal, even before life goes to work on us.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that is valuable about things like Myers-Briggs tests, you can argue about their scientific validity, but it just gives us a kind of value-neutral language to talk about things that are often quite freighted with judgment. So, I'm quite. I mean, I would say I'm quite disorganized, but that's. But when I say I'm a P, that sounds a lot less awful, and it gives people a chance to help see things from different perspectives without implying that you're casting judgment on them. And I think that's actually kind of relevant to what I've been trying to say, because there's no emotion word that doesn't have some value judgment attached to it. And in different languages that might be different. Anger let's just stick with the example of anger. The ancient, if you read the Iliad, anger is a kind of quite virtuous emotion. It's an emotion of self-assertion and military masculinity, whereas now it's seen as a kind of loss of control a lot of the time. And again, it depends on who you're thinking about. Female anger is often treated as more uncontrolled than male anger, and more powerful. And female anger is often vilified. So I think that's the sort of the way in which the language we use about feelings is constantly in flux, and constantly we're being given different ways to express feelings. And I think we just have much more variety, despite much more of a wide menu of emotions available to us than we often acknowledge. And so I think that my problem with basic emotions, just to bring it back to that, is just that it implies that we're a slave to these uncontrollable bits of our animal biology, which we just have to accept that they exist, and the only question is how much we express them and whether we're allowed to express them. But I think that we have much more agency, and there's a much richer world of emotion, cultural world of emotion out there.
Right. I was going to bring up the Iliad too, but you beat me to it. Well, let's talk about that idea of expressing emotions, all right? Because I think there's also a sense, I mean, for 100 years or so, we've been more or less on the same page, I would argue anyway, with Freud's essential statement, he says, unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways. There's that idea, anyway, that if you're not expressing your emotions, you're conceivably damaging yourself. Here in America, the number 4 book on the bestseller list, been there for 71 weeks, a book called The Body Keeps Score, Brain, Mind, and Body and the Healing of Trauma by Bessel van der Kolk, who also works off this idea that, that our emotions, if not dealt with in real time, will hurt us. But, there are massive cultural differences about this. And, as an Irish American, Edgar, and you're you, I mean, I would say Anglo-Saxon and Celtic people have this kind of notion that maybe you do stuff down your emotions. We're God's frozen people, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very keen on therapy and talking about emotions and being emotionally open, but I don't think there are no downsides to that. There are studies of atrocities where people have, so therapists have visited communities that have been damaged by some collective tragedy years later, and suddenly mental health difficulties have popped up among that population because they've had a structure for containing those feelings that's been disrupted by the insistence that they need to talk about it in order to be healthy. So I think it's there's no one correct way of encountering feelings or managing them.
Right, and there are big cultural differences there. I mean, getting ready for this show, I found a study of Belgian and Japanese couples in which they were sort of given the same scenarios and then sort of interrogated about their emotions and their emotional reactions to it. And ultimately, the Japanese couple saw nothing wrong with suppressing emotions, or saw very little wrong with suppressing emotions compared to I don't know whether Belgian people are particularly emotionally volatile or not. I don't know why they were chosen as the antithesis, but there was a real cultural difference that probably, isn't viewed as neurotic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here in Britain, we've definitely had a kind of reckoning with that in the last 20 or 30 years. There's a narrative that we've just become much more emotional due to your influence, you Americans, that we used to have this idea of stiff upper lip, and the best way of kind of encountering difficult things was basically to suppress more or less, and to kind of soldier on and remain stoical.
Well, the series The Crown is, a 4-year interrogation of that very question and what happens to people in a family where, in fact, there really is an almost pathological suppression of emotions and corresponding withholding of emotions. And it's not a pretty picture there. Absolutely.
And then also with the royal family, Princess Diana died in 1997, and there was this outpouring of grief and mourning and kind of sentimentality, but I'm not implying that it was insincere. I was quite young at that point, but I just remember sudden transformation of sight. I remember my little sister, who was even younger than me, she must have been 3 years old, waking up at 4:00 and finding out about Princess Diana's death, having never really heard of her even before, and by kind of breakfast time, she was setting up a little shrine in our living room.
Well, the movie The Queen is in fact about Tony Blair's effort to get Queen Elizabeth to do something about this. That she doesn't have any emotional effusion. She doesn't see any need for it. She probably does regard this as something that came over from the Americas, and she doesn't want to have to deal with it. And he ultimately persuades her, no, the public is going to need to see an emotion from you. It's almost, I think, scary to not see emotions at a time when you think they're called for. Go ahead.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's often treated as the moment when we started to be more kind of emotionally effusive, and perhaps sometimes emotionally performative, if you want to frame it in a different way. But in a way, the kind of stiff upper lip idea is more complicated than sometimes people assume, because there's always been a sentimentality to British culture. So the Victorians were the people who are probably most famous for refusing to be moved by things. Queen Victoria saying she was not amused. But then Queen Victoria was also the person who mourned for decades after her husband's death. And they had this very, very kind of rich, almost fetishistic mourning culture. So I think that kind of emotional style of stoicism can also come along with a sort of an implication that there are deep emotions lying underneath that you're sort of tacitly expressing even when you're performing the suppression of them. So I don't think it's ever as simple as just emotionality versus lack of emotionality. I think we have a language of emotional expression which can also involve silence, or involve a kind of stoicism, or a sort of public struggle with the feelings that you're having.
Right. I think one of the things your book deals with really well, I don't think we're going to have time to really discuss it, but professions, jobs where, in fact, you're expected to manage your emotions in a kind of an extreme way. You talk about flight attendants, waitresses, childcare workers, bouncers, police officers, tax collectors, all have to kind of do performative emotions and not perform their real emotions. And I think here during the pandemic, it's gotten worse because you're dealing with people who are crazy and defying rules, and you're still not supposed to crack. You're still not supposed to tell them to F off. Yeah. And there's got to be some massive cost to all that. We're going to take a quick break, though, and don't worry, our guest will be back here for the second segment. We've got so much more to talk about.
Hoping you would let it go, and you did. I have motion sickness. Somebody roll the windows down. I could scream to drown you out. I'm on the outside looking through. Sometimes I don't know. Sometimes I don't know. I just don't know what to feel. Sometimes I don't know. Sometimes I don't know what to feel. Everything I thought that I knew.
Well, sometimes we don't know what to feel. And we also don't know why we're feeling what we're feeling. Our guest, Edgar Gerard Hughes, is the editor of the Book of Emotions, also known as How Do You Feel in the United States, a researcher at London's Queen Mary Center for the History of the Emotions. And he's with us now. One thing that we probably should get into, because you get into it a lot, is the physicality of emotions, the bodily topography of emotions, rages here, anxieties here, in all these different places, and that whole question. I think you said William James as sort of saying, well, maybe what's happening here is you're having a set of physical reactions because you just saw a bear. And your heart started racing, and this started happening, and so then the emotion becomes the name of that set of physical reactions that you're having. I don't know. Maybe say a little bit more about how you see this. This is another moving target, right? It changes across time and across cultures.
Yeah. So the what's known as the James Lang theory of emotions, that the idea that it's not that you feel fear and then your heart starts racing, or you feel love and then you feel butterflies in your stomach. It's the other way around. What the emotion is just a subjective experience of something that's going on in your body. So, for instance, he talks about seeing a bear. I don't know whether he actually saw a bear. I very much doubt it. But the idea is that instead of seeing the bear, feeling fear and then running, what would happen is you'd see the bear, your heart would start to pulsate, your palms would start to sweat, and then you'd kind of label those feelings fear, and then you'd run away. That's one way of thinking about emotions, which is quite close to this kind of physicalist idea I was talking about at the beginning. I think that's very valid in a lot of contexts. I think there's undeniably a massive physicality to emotions. In fact, sometimes I feel like that's the only thing I can say for sure about emotions, is that when I sit still and examine myself, is that I have all of this kind of unease and strange kind of awareness of things going on in my body, and that I'm feeling some sort of emotion, and beyond that, it's all up for grabs, really. But there's another way of thinking about emotions, which is called cognitive account of emotions, which is that when you feel fear, what you're really doing is saying it involves making a prediction about the future. So you see something that you think might be dangerous, you're deciding that it's dangerous, and that idea of danger is part of the fear as well. So that's something that implies that emotion would involve the whole brain rather than just one small part of it that has to do with the awareness of your body. And that gives a lot more scope for thinking about the way emotions are psychologically constructed. So we're taught how to feel emotions as children in that view of them. When you see a child crying, you might say to them, "You're just sad," rather than anything else, or this is not real sadness. You're just tired, or don't be angry when they're kind of lashing out or something like that. You're in a way teaching them a vocabulary of emotions that implies some kind of actual judgment that they have some control over those things. So those are the two different ways of thinking about them. But in any case, there's no doubt the emotions always involve the body, and they feel like very bodily things. I think that you can't really make a distinction between body and mind when it comes to emotions, but I honestly don't think you can even when it comes to thought. So, yeah.
So you get into this next thing in the book. I happen also to be in the middle of reading Clara and the Sun, Ishiguro's new novel about an artificial intelligence companion who is studying people all the time, trying to understand their emotions and their emotional cues and what they all mean, and how their eyes might tell a different story from what they're saying, but also seems to be developing some kind of set of emotions on her or its own all the time. This is not a new theme. People who watch Star Trek, Kat, we're going to go to B1 right now, know this whole conversation very well.
For the past 6 hours, I have attempted to produce an emotional response by subjecting myself to various stimuli.
Like what?
I listened to several operas known to be uplifting. I watched 3 holodeck programs designed to be humorous. And I made 4 attempts to induce sexual desire by subjecting myself to erotic imagery.
What happened?
Nothing.
I'm curious. Why are you ignoring the one emotion you've already experienced? Why aren't you trying to make yourself angry again?
Anger is a negative emotion. I wanted to concentrate on something more positive.
Data, feelings aren't positive and negative. They simply exist. It's what we do with those feelings that becomes good or bad. For example, feeling angry about an injustice could lead someone to take a positive action to correct it.
But my study of humanity indicates there are some emotions that are harmful, such as jealousy or hatred.
Those are very strong emotions, and you're right. Very little good can come from them. But I don't think that an exploration of anger need necessarily lead to hatred or malice.
But what if it does, Counselor?
All right, Edgar, I'm guessing you could do about an hour of reaction to that clip at a bunch of different levels. I have a specific place I want to go, but I do want to let you. I want to let you react on your own to what you just heard.
Oh, I mean, it's a great clip. It's very funny. I think this whole that whole theme of kind of emotions being a core part of how artificial intelligence can come across as human is so interesting. And actually, there are lots and lots of AI researchers now working on kind of trying to teach machines emotional intelligence, because there's such a sense that this is something kind of uniquely and purely human. I think that's I don't necessarily fully disagree with it, but I think it's an interesting idea that's worth exploring. But obviously there's not a machine that he's talking to, but I think that when you're talking about Clara and the Sun, it's it kind of taps into the same sort of themes.
Right, and it also taps into the themes about whether there are, emotions that are intrinsically good or intrinsically bad.
Absolutely.
And Counselor Troy is kind of pushing back against the idea that anger has to be bad all the time. That's also something that you talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the pieces I've commissioned in this book is a sort of a celebration of female anger as a sort of revolutionary force. So that's one way in which I think anger has been rehabilitated a lot recently, is the idea that the anger of oppressed people can be something really empowering. And then on the other hand, I always think of Brett Kavanaugh in the USA, his performance in his hearing, to projecting this anger, which I've no doubt was very deliberately felt, but was also this strategy. And it feels like there was a very big difference between that kind of anger and an anger that comes from sort of lashing out in the moment and lacking a sense of control. But I mean, I would question, to be honest, that in that clip where the therapist seems to accept that there are some intrinsically negative emotions that should be suppressed. But I think there are lots of people who would say that jealousy is partly a consciousness of inequality and injustice, and that even that emotion can be a positive thing. I think that envy has its purposes as well, and it really depends on the story you tell about those things.
Right. Well, there's envy and then there's jealousy. And jealousy also is, one of the things that the book does is to treat love as an emotion. I would argue that love is a condition from which depend on strings, this whole menu of emotions that are occasioned by love, one of them being jealousy. But you probably can't feel that particular kind of jealousy unless you have really loved.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Love, I guess, another one that's interesting to think about in the context of different cultures, because, when we think about love, our mind tends to go to romantic love, but really it's just a whole complex of different emotional experiences that you might have. And this idea of like romantic chivalric love actually sprung up at different parts of the world in different times, but it's not universal, and it certainly doesn't encapsulate everything we think of when we think of love. And maybe it's more, maybe in some contexts, when we're thinking about, I've started meditating recently, and when people talk about love and meditation, it's more about an attitude to the world, a sort of openness to experience. And maybe that's a more useful way of thinking about love. But I think that it's a huge category, and we're quite confused when we talk about it, because I don't think that my love of yogurt is the same as my love of my mum, is the same as my love of existence when I'm feeling in the most benevolent possible mood. So I think that talking about love and emotion is a very, very complicated and confusing idea.
All right. We will get you even more confused on the other side of this break, because we're going to be joined by another guest. John Koenig is going to join me and Edgar to talk about our words for emotions and the value of maybe inventing words when the right word doesn't exist for a complex interplay of emotions. So that's all coming up after this. For today's show, the technical producer, as usual, was Kat Pastor. I don't know much about her emotional state, but I do know that she believes that her emotional state could whip your emotional state's ass. And Lily Taylor, our senior producer, is also the producer of this episode. What did I say, Taylor? What's wrong with me? I must be having emotions. Lily Tyson is our senior producer. I don't even know who our senior producer is. That's how emotional I'm feeling right now. And I'm sure, by the way, John Koenig is going to have a word for that, for forgetting somebody's name and then feeling terrible about it. He is the author of the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. Also still with us, Edgar Gerard Hughes, who is a researcher at London's Queen Mary Center for the History of Emotions and the editor of the Book of Emotions, also known as How Do You Feel in the United States. Before we get to John, Edgar, one of the interesting things here is that there are a lot of old words for emotions that have not survived. And one particular pattern is that, because this comes up a lot, when people notice that you can be disgruntled but not gruntled. You can be dismayed but not made. You can be ruthless but not ruthful. You can be reckless but not wreckful. But once upon a time, you could be all those opposite things, right?
Yeah, no, those are called lost positives. So we still have the negation of those terms, but we've lost somewhere along the way the original word. So, for instance, ruthful. Ruth is actually like an idea meaning something like tenderness and compassion and sorrow. Maybe one of the obscure sorrows that we're going to talk about. But you could once be ruthful or ruthless, but now ruthless is the only survivor. And you could be similarly gruntled, scornful, or wreckful, or made rather than dismayed. So yeah, it's interesting that these kind of emotions that apparently once existed have fallen by the wayside.
There's also, I think, there's a kind of a chicken and egg question about how different cultures have different words in them for different emotions, right? I mean, the Russians have a word, I think it's toska, which describes maddening dissatisfaction. Which, if you've known a lot of Russians, you could sort of see why there would need to be a word like that. But you sort of wonder, is there a word like that because it's a particularly Russian condition, emotional condition, or is it somehow the other way around? Or they just gotten better at naming things? I don't expect you to know the answer to that, but I'd love to hear what you thought.
I mean, that's the $1 million question, really, isn't it? I think that in a way you can't. The cheat answer is that you can't really disentangle the two, as far as I'm concerned. That, you know, the words for emotions, the languages and structures that we have for expressing emotions, in some way they become part of the emotion itself. So, I mean, you can say that when for instance, Bertrand Russell has a section a section of the book of his where he talks about falling in love the moment he first said "I love you," and that's when the love came into being, because expressing it somehow gave him permission to interpret his feelings in those ways. And I think that's true with all emotions to some extent, but you know, once we find a word for them, then a kind of clarity and coherence to them comes into being. So maybe if we were Russian, we would leap for that word more often, and therefore feel that feeling more often.
Well, that's a perfect on-ramp for our other guest. John Koenig is here with us. He is a specialist in fact, inventing words that do not exist for emotions that do. I've got your whole list here, John. First of all, welcome to our conversation. I've got your whole list here, but it probably makes sense, at least at the beginning, to have you pick. Give us a few of your favorite words.
Sure. There's one in particular that seems to have caught on in a way that almost became a real word in and of itself. It's sonder. It's the awareness that everyone around you is the main character of their own story, though to you they're just random passersby passing in the background, the extras in your story. But the reality is that they're the main characters as well in their own story.
I think you've had the experience of overhearing people in a public space use this word that you made up as if it were a completely usable word.
That's right, and it adorns the names of coffee shops and billion-dollar corporations, and it appears in tattoos, and it's all over in a way that really changed my attitude about language, because it reinforces that all the words that we use every day and take so seriously were invented by people really not too different from me.
Right. Is there a word for the emotion you feel when you hear a word that you invented being incorporated into the common tongue?
I'll work on that one.
Yeah. All right. Give us another one.
Sure. There is, let's see, nictus, which is it's an adjective. It's feeling quietly overjoyed to be the only one awake in the middle of the night.
There is sort of, an opposite counterpart to nictus, right? Which is the dismay about being the only one awake in the middle of the night.
Yeah. I have a similar one, actually, that's aubadouar, which is the point just before 5 a.m. when, the romanticism of a late night suddenly turns over and you hear the birds chirping and the sun starts rising. And you're like, oh, God, I still haven't gone to bed. So let me bring up another one. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Is it lachism, laichism? Lachicism.
Lachicism. Explain what that is.
That's the longing for the clarity of disaster. So, when there's a storm approaching on the horizon and, you hope everything goes well, but a part of you is actually rooting for the storm, to just complete catastrophe that could just shake up your life and clarify all of your priorities.
Right. It's interesting. George Carlin had I think he got turned into an album, but he had this whole routine that began. I kind of like it when a lot of people die, and he he described the fact that he enjoyed hearing about disasters. He enjoyed oncoming disasters. He enjoyed the notion. He said like the worst words. I mean, he's a comedian, so it's unclear how much he meant this. But comedians are always trying to tap into what we really do feel. And he said, the nobody was hurt is his least favorite thing to hear at the end of a news story about a hurricane.
Right. And I empathize with that, even though part of me is also, appalled as it should be. But yeah.
So, Edgar, as you're listening to this, and I'm sure you're aware of John's work anyway, I mean, this is sort of the process of history, right? There always are people looking, just in the same sense that John had the experience of hearing his word Sonder suddenly getting used in common parlance. As he says, that's what happens, right? You have to come up with these words.
Yeah, no, words are invented by people, and that must be an amazing feeling to hear a word that you've coined being used by people in a completely different context. But yeah, I mean that's true of a lot of emotions that they didn't necessarily come up organically. In some cases, like boredom, for instance, boredom was a word that was basically invented in the 19th century by an obscure columnist, but then kind of popularized by Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens in Bleak House was the first person to really introduce the concept of boredom, and before then, boredom in some sense didn't exist. So that's one great example of it, and that there are some other examples like that in which kind of literary figures or comedians have introduced the name for words. But another very common thing is for words from psychology to be taken on by kind of ordinary vernacular. So, for instance, nostalgia. Yes. That was basically a term invented to describe the feelings felt by soldiers who were far away, and that was actually supposed to be a deadly disorder. People were dying of nostalgia. It was a kind of like pathological homesickness.
Right. That one was coined by Johannes Hofer in 1688. Right. And yeah, it was, I think the occasion of it might have been the 30 Years' War. At least 6 soldiers were discharged from the Spanish army of Flanders with mal de corazon. There was something wrong. Mm-hmm. There was something kind of wrong with them emotionally. And somehow or other, we've transformed this. I'd love to have both of you react to this, actually, but Edgar, you can start. We've transformed nostalgia into a very kind of desirable state of mind. I mean, yes, there's some kind of sense of longing or pining for the past, but there's also a sense of having experienced a past worth longing or pining for.
Yeah, there's a kind of wistful romanticism to the idea of nostalgia, which definitely didn't exist in the original sort of pathological form of nostalgia. And that's quite common, actually, that you could say something similar about melancholia. Melancholia was originally, again, a serious disorder, something a little bit like depression, but it often came with something called the glass disorder. The glass, basically, people used to think that they were made of glass and that any tiny touch would shatter them, sometimes almost literally. So that's kind of softened again from being this emotional disorder into being something almost quite desirable, like a poetic kind of sadness, and that kind of interchange between the language of disease and psychological disease and the language of just ordinary everyday feeling is I think that's one of the really interesting things about the way that we talk about emotions and how it's developed over history.
Yeah, John,
I totally agree. I think it's that's one of the things that I've tried to do with this book. It's the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, is a sort of redeem sadness itself, and turn it into. I think typically people tend to conflate it with despair as the absence of hope. But for me, at least, sadness can be just a tremendous presence. It's an upwelling. That the etymology of the word sadness it originally meant fullness. From the same root as sated and satisfaction, and so I think if we open ourselves to the beauty of sadness, we can remind ourselves how fleeting and mysterious and open-ended life can be.
Right. Well, I want to bring up another one of your words, which I believe is pronounced onism. Am I pronouncing it correctly? O-N-I-S-M?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Onism.
Yeah. So this has nothing to do with spilling your seed. That's a different word. But explain onism to us.
Yeah, sure. Onism is the awareness of how little of the world you'll experience before you die. You only have one body. You only have one lifetime. And so you're just barely scratching the surface of all that existence has to offer.
And what's explain the utility of a word like that? Like why do we need that word?
I think, as we were saying earlier in the conversation, having a word for something can kind of crystallize something that was just sort of in the background. And by shining a light on it, you can make that feeling present and you can give yourself permission to feel it. In the case of onism, it's, whenever I walk through an airport, and you walk by so many gates heading to so many exotic places all around the world, but you only have one gate, and that's where you'll go, and you'll have to sort of make your peace with that. There's something beautiful about having to make your peace with a part of reality, and I think it helps us connect with each other if we can do that a little more clearly.
And I suppose also just acknowledging the existence of onism, and our own onism means also that you shouldn't let this one life fly by. You may just scratch the surface of reality, but you want to make a fairly deep scratch.
Exactly. Yeah, we have such a tiny window to enjoy our lives. Make of it as much as you can.
Edgar, it does seem also that when the word doesn't exist and John can't be reached on his phone to get him to invent the word that we need, the other thing that we do, and we've been alluding to this all along, is borrow it from another language. And so, yes, Schadenfreude is a great example. But so there are several different words in other languages. I think the Danish one is the one that we've been borrowing the most for the feeling of being cozy despite inclement and cold weather, right? There's, I don't even know how to pronounce Hygge. Every time I learn it, I immediately forget. Hygge. Yeah, so that's a word that we want, right? Because we know what that word means, and yet we don't have it.
Yeah, and I think that people love reading about these words that exist in other languages, because there's a little frisson of pleasure about hearing something described that you can really relate to, but have never heard encapsulated in that way, which is why I think John's book is such a great idea. But yeah, there are so many examples of that. Another great one that is kind of coming into the language more and more is giggle. Have you heard of that?
No.
This is a term for the sort of disconcertingly violent impulse you feel towards things that are cute. So you might want to squeeze a cat, or you might even have some kind of like alarming rush of a slightly bloodthirsty instinct when you see something cute. And there's actually lots of scientific research into this and various explanations for why it might be. But yeah, there are all kinds of examples like that of words that exist in other languages, and in some cases they seem to say something specific about that culture which we can't really relate to. Something about kind of cultures with honor systems or histories of displacement. But in other cases they like speak to something that seems really universal that we haven't quite put our finger on yet.
So, John, a lot of your words kind of have to do, I think, with existential questions. I mean, onism does, Sonder does to a certain degree. There's another one. Once again, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce these words. Embedo. You say embedo, I say embedo. Tell us what that is.
Yeah, so the ambedo is a momentary trance of emotional clarity. And that's one of the ones that was sort of hardest to pin down, but I think it has to do with language. It's a certain mood when you look around and you find yourself just sort of present in existence, where you're just sort of, shrug off whatever thing is supposed to mean, and instead just take it for what it is. And I think it's sort of an accidental meditation, if anything. You just soak in the melancholy of being alive, and to me it's a tremendous thrill. Embedo.
Yeah, no, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to go for the embedo. I don't know how volitional it is, or whether you just either get it or you don't. But it seems to be worth striving for. But I mean, that actually sort of pinpoints probably the last question we'll have time to explore. Hopefully, I can get both of you to comment on it. But John, maybe you start. Do we wind up understanding our emotional lives better as a result of having these new or different words for them? There's a sense in which a lot of the times we're sort of not experiencing embedo because we're not even really aware of who we are or what we're doing or how we're feeling in the universe at a given moment.
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons that language comes about. One is to allow you to talk about things that you can see clearly around you, and talk about the buffalo in the field. But then there's also, we use language to organize, the storehouse inside our own heads. And that second use, I think, is the one that's been the most neglected. And I've gotten a lot of emails from people in response to my book saying that, even if I never use this in conversation, it gives me a tremendous sense of solace to be able to recognize it while it's just me sitting alone in a room. And, it's a beautiful thing.
All right, I'm now having the emotion of having lied to my guest because I don't have time to hear Edgar out on this. But Edgar Gerard Hughes, researcher at London's Queen Mary Center for the History of Emotions, the editor of the Book of Emotions, also known as How Do You Feel in the United States, John Koenig, author of The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. Thanks once again to Lily Tyson for producing this show, Kat Pastor for technically producing this show, and to all of you for listening. I'm experiencing an emotion of gratitude.
I can't stop the nothing I can see but you when you dance. Feel the good creeping up on you, so just dance. All those things I shouldn't do, but you dance. Ain't nobody leaving, so keep dancing.